Morning, Janet. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you. As Janet mentioned, I started with Bright in May, and so this is a new role, a new position at the MLS, and it's sort of a commitment on the part of Bright to do more research, to be more of a resource on the housing market, to provide value both to subscribers as well as to consumers and the media. And I had, prior to being here at Bright, which I started in May, for 4 years was the chief economist down at Virginia Realtors. So I have maybe seen you all in that capacity. And before that, it was a long time ago, feels like ages ago now, worked for the Center for Regional Analysis at George Mason University, and have really been looking at housing market and economic and demographic trends in the Washington area for, I mean, it's crazy when you start saying you've been doing something for 25 years, it really hits home at how old you're getting. So I feel like it's definitely been that long. I am a proud Northern Virginia resident, have lived here in Northern Virginia now for 28 years at this point. And so I'm always delighted to talk with agents and brokers, but if you don't tell anybody, I'm going to tell you, I really like coming and talking to folks in Northern Virginia because this is my home. And particularly today, as the housing market is in a very challenging transition period, I think it's more important than ever that, agents and brokers are being sort of the local economist for your consumers, right? So being the source of information on what's going on in the local housing market, because there's a lot of noise out there about what's going on nationally. There's a lot of fear, I think, about the unknown since the last time we had a housing market slowdown was, 15, 16 years ago during the crash. So there's a lot of concerns. And I think sort of grounding where we are in the market with kind of fundamentals and being able to dispel some myths maybe, and also sort of offer a sense of where the market is really in Northern Virginia and Loudoun County, and then also, what we might expect going forward. So everybody, we're all on mute, except for myself, of course, and just to keep things quiet. But if you have questions, pop them in the chat during the PowerPoint, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. And then everybody will unmute and we'll have questions afterwards. I love questions, but I love even more if you have observations on what's going on in your local market that may be different than what I'm seeing in the data, or if you're seeing a trend you think we should be tracking. I'm always eager to hear those kinds of things. I want to give a little bit of a lay of the land on where we are in the economy. This just shows how the gross domestic product in the U.S. has been changing. GDP, as you all know, is just a measure of all of the value of all the goods and services that are exchanged in the U.S. economy. Look, you can see what happened back during the spring of 2020, where the whole economy kind of locked down. Economic activity really rebounded very quickly. We've had a couple of quarters where GDP growth has been really slow, but third quarter GDP numbers came out suggesting that we actually saw a nearly 3% increase in gross domestic product on an annual basis. And so there's a lot of fluctuation, and we watch these numbers because it can tell us, whether the economy is really contracting and whether we should fear that there's a recession coming. And while there are growing risks of an economic recession in 2023, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, right now there's still a lot of positive signs in the economy. And I'll point to here to employment. You can see this is the Washington metro area, and we talk about jobs, of course, because jobs are really the driver of the home buying community. So when folks have a job and they feel confident in their job and their wages, they're more likely to be able to buy a home. We're going to talk about all those factors that are really challenging to buyers right now, but job growth has been steadily increasing since the decline back in the spring of 2020. We're not quite back where we were prior to the pandemic in the Washington area. We are on a national basis. But when you talk about some of these jobs in government, in professional and business services, some of the higher wage jobs, we are back to pre-pandemic levels. Our unemployment rate here in the Washington area is back as low as it was prior to the pandemic, meaning that the labor market is still very tight. There's still wage growth because employers are still having a hard time finding workers. And all of those things suggest that even as there's concerns about inflation and other challenges in the economy, that the labor market conditions, at least right now, are still very, very tight. And as we sort of look ahead, we have to think about, what would change that, and sort of persistently high inflation, persistently high rates, could eventually have an impact on the labor market. But right now, labor market conditions are pretty strong. What is not strong is how people feel, right? So even if folks feel like their job is stable, they may have even gotten a raise, they may have switched jobs and found an even better income. There's still a lot of pessimism. And frankly, it's just because we've been through so much. So this is a measure of consumer sentiment that the University of Michigan puts out every month. And it basically asks people how they feel about the economy, their own personal economic situations. And we have data back for decades. And this is the lowest level. We hit the lowest level of consumer sentiment on record back during the summer. And this was when inflation had peaked, when there was housing market had begun to really, contract. Mortgage rates had more than doubled. People were frankly exhausted from COVID and the pandemic. And so you can see that consumer sentiment, fell when COVID hit, and then it bopped back up. And so we are at a lower level of consumer sentiment now than we were in the midst of a global pandemic back in the summer of 2020. And that really tells you about where people's mindsets are. One of the main reasons that consumer sentiment has been so low has been those higher inflation rates. And not only higher, but also the fact that inflation has risen so quickly. And I think that's partially the explanation of why consumer sentiment is so low. Is we had been moving along for the last couple of years where inflation and rates had been just so low, but both of those metrics changed so quickly. And there was just this reaction that people felt like all of the uncertainty was really taking a toll. Inflation is just a measure of how much things cost now compared to where they were a year ago. And it takes into account a whole basket, they call it a basket of goods and services that consumers buy. Everything from groceries to airline tickets to health services to housing. Housing is captured a little bit weird in the CPI measures. It's not home prices, but it does include rent, and it includes something called owner costs, which is basically a measure of how much you could rent your house for right now if you went out and tried to rent your home. So I think that the upshot is that rates have been, inflation has been rising since the pandemic really started as supply chains have been locked down. Then when demand surged after some of the COVID restrictions hit, supply couldn't keep up with that consumer demand. And now we're in a situation where wages have begun to rise, which is also putting upward pressure on inflation. So as a result, we know that the Federal Reserve has had to take action in order to try and bring inflation down to that benchmark level of between 2% and 4%. But right now, inflation is still front of mind. People who may have been saving for a down payment for a home are not only facing rising mortgage rates, which I'll talk about in a minute, but they're also seeing that, every month their basic household necessities are costing more and might be eating into that savings. That's been a real challenge for some moderate income and first-time buyers. So consumers are a little gloomy. Home builders are super gloomy. So this measure of home builder confidence has declined for 9 months in a row. Here in this, we're in the South region. Consumer, which is just how the National Association of Home Builders organizes their data. And we're actually a little bit better than other places in terms of home builder confidence, but there have been a lot of challenges to building new housing, from all of the difficulties in getting materials, window frames, doors, roofing materials, to lumber costs that really skyrocketed over the last couple of years. Have come down, but materials costs are still quite high. Builders are having a hard time finding labor. They face the same challenges they've always faced with local regulation and land use issues. And now they're seeing that buyer traffic has dried up considerably. So home builders have actually pulled back on new construction. and have begun not to cut prices yet, but to offer more concessions to try and get quick move-ins. But the home builder confidence is also low, meaning that the overall picture for the housing market remains very tepid in these period of economic uncertainty. We're going to take a little bit of a look ahead in just a minute, but I want to show you where kind of the housing market is as we sort of head into fall. We put out monthly stats, and so this is as of October. This is the Washington, D.C. metro area, which is defined by the counties you can see there on the right. It's a little bit smaller than maybe the typical D.C. metro area. This chart shows the number of closed sales in 1 month compared to the same month a year ago. If you see in the kind of middle of the chart, you can see home sales plummeted in April and May of 2020 as everything locked down as a result of the pandemic. But as you know, home sales really surged throughout the summer of 2020, into the fall, into the winter. We lost all seasonality in the housing market. Buyers were drawn into the market as a result of historically low mortgage rates. People were working and learning from home, and their house was sort of closing in on them. And then for many people, their financial pictures actually improved during the pandemic as the level of personal savings increased. People weren't spending money on other things. What we've seen really since the middle of last year is a sort of reduction in the pace of home sales activity. So year over year, home sales have been down really since last fall. Part of that retraction in home sales activity is a lot of the buying activity that might have happened, let's say in 2021, actually got pushed ahead to 2020. Then buyers were out on the market, particularly in Loudoun County. Inventory got really tight really quickly. So there just weren't any homes to buy. And that's the initial reason why we saw home sales activity slow. But now in recent months, with the number of home sales down in Loudoun County, 35% compared to a year ago, we're really seeing the impact of higher mortgage rates on buyers. You can see that here for Loudoun County. In September, the number of closed sales was down 35% compared to last September. And then I've overlaid that blue line shows where average 30-year mortgage rates have been. So we can see they were down around 3%, and home sales were booming. And then as mortgage rates began to rise, it was eroding buyers' purchasing power, locking some folks out of the market, and frankly, making some prospective buyers who might have been moving maybe for kind of more discretionary reasons, as opposed to having to move. It forced those buyers to maybe, take a second and decide if this was the right time. So home sales have really declined as a result of these higher mortgage rates. So we're tracking not only behind last year and the year before, we're actually tracking below 2019 levels. And I expect that as we end the year, we're going to continue to see the pace of sales activity slow considerably, because we're also seeing inventory dry up again, or new listings dry up again, despite the fact that home sales are slower, right? Despite the fact that there's fewer buyers in the market, the buyers that remain in the market are still finding it fairly competitive. It's a really odd situation we find ourselves in because both demand and supply have shrunk. So metro-wide, the median sales price in September was still up 3.3% compared to a year ago. Now you can see that is a much slower pace of price growth than we were seeing earlier in the year and last year, but it's actually about average, right? On average, home prices in the Washington metro area rise between 3 and 5% annually. And in some markets across the metro, we can see that prices are still rising fairly quickly. In Loudoun County, the median sales price is up 6.7% compared to where we were a year ago. Again, lower price growth than we've seen, but still rising. So there's a lot of concern out there that we might have prices come crashing down. People are concerned that they might be buying at the height of the market. Right now, prices are still rising because inventory is still very low. And then the buyers that are out there are still, having relatively few properties to choose from. I do expect we will see price growth continue to fall. And I do expect that we will see prices fall from their peak levels, which was actually back in the summer. We've already fallen from peak levels. Even if home prices do fall from their peak levels by 5, 10, even 15%, in Loudoun County, the Washington metro area, we're still going to see home values that will be 20, 30% higher than they were back in 2019. So all that is to say is I would expect there's going to be some price correction here over the next few months. But if someone bought a few years ago and they're worried about ending up underwater, there's really no concern that I can see in terms of prices coming down that fast. The primary reason why price growth will stay firm and prices aren't going to fall in our region is the fact that inventory is still very low. You can see at the metro level, inventory, the number of active listings at the end of September was actually 4.6% lower than it was last year. We have a little bit of a blip in inventory back in July, but since then, we're still seeing that inventory is lower than it was a year ago. Now, there are some places, and Loudoun County is one of them, where we've actually seen inventory begin to rise. And in September, the number of active listings at the end of the month in Loudoun County was up 23% compared to last year. However, and I say however, inventory had gotten so low during the pandemic, as you all remember. We were counting months of supply. No, we weren't counting months of supply. We were counting days of supply in terms of inventory last year. So we are rising from a very low level. And even in September, the number of active listings is still only about 40% of what it was back 3 years ago. And there is still just over a month's supply of inventory in the county. So there's been a lot of talk that, it is now a buyer's market and that the market has shifted. In our local market, and really, frankly, most places around the region, in the Washington area, Baltimore, Philly, most of the mid-Atlantic, we're still talking about, 1 to 2 months of supply. So we typically think of 4 to 5 months of supply as being a balanced market, and anything above that being a buyer's market. And we are just very, very far away from that. That is the primary reason why prices are still rising. The buyers that remain in the market are facing very low inventory. So if you're working with someone who is thinking about selling and they're worried that there's not a buyer out there for them, we're finding that homes that are priced appropriately are not only finding buyers, but they're finding buyers quickly, and they are getting asking price. The number of buyers in the market will continue to decline. As I mentioned, through the fourth quarter, new pending sales in September down 33% in the Washington area, down 36% compared to where we were a year ago. And as you know, that new pending sales number is a little preview of where closed sales will be. I'm expecting that, we'll see 2022, the overall number of transactions will be certainly down compared to where we were last year, down even, I think, compared to 2019. So overall transaction volume down a little bit as we sort of are resetting expectations in this new market. Part of that resetting, frankly, has been a benefit to buyers, right? Buyers now have a little bit more time to make decisions. They have a little bit more leverage in terms of price, and they also have the ability to ask for things from the seller that they weren't able to over the last 2 years. Home inspections, appraisals, in some cases, a home sales contingency, certainly asking for drops in price, being able to negotiate on price, being able to take some time. The median days on market rose to 15 for the DC metro area, rose to 16 there in Loudoun County. That is up, right, from where we were, 6 months ago, where the median days on market was like 6. And I mean, like half of all homes were selling in less than 6 days. So 16 feels like a big change in the market. And in some ways it is. but we are definitely still seeing that median days on market lower than where it is traditionally. And here's the data for Loudoun County. We're kind of back up close to where we were back in 2019, 2018 in Loudoun County. Median days on market of about 16. Loudoun County has always been a fast moving housing market, and now we're back to that. Again, that is a sign that the housing market has cooled, but it's also a sign that buyers are able to take their time, and the buyers you may be working with in the market be able to go back to sellers. I'm even seeing sellers paying closing costs now, when that was certainly not something we were seeing a year ago or even 6 months ago. So overall, right, housing market has slowed. It's slowed on the buyer side and it has slowed on the seller side. We're seeing new listings are down. The whole market has just contracted. And by contracted, I don't mean crashed. I just mean it's resetting with fewer players in the market. But the fundamentals are still very low inventory, buyers facing relatively few choices, which means relatively stable prices as we look ahead. But we do know that sellers are going to have to reset their price expectations in this new market. You know, it has been this market where, you know, a home would sell, you know, in 1 month, and then 3 months later, a similar home was getting 10% more. And then 3 months later, a seller of a similar property was getting 20% more. Those expectations really need to be tamped down. And sellers are resetting their expectations. And it is more important than ever that they are, you know, getting valuable insights from their realtor on what is appropriate in the market. I talk about this resetting price expectations as sort of, you know, these sort of 5 stages of grief that the sellers are going through, you know, anger, disappointment, depression, finally getting to acceptance. Because you can see in Loudoun County, which is the light blue lines, when homes are first listed, very unlikely to see a price drop. But after homes have been on the market 2 weeks, 42% of sellers are dropping the price. That's actually making a difference. It's bringing in some buyers. Homes that remain on the market more than a month, you know, nearly 2/3 of sellers are dropping their home price. And I think that is kind of the market that we're in as we're resetting. Sometimes sellers are still coming in too high, and they're dropping their price by about 6%. We're sort of seeing in Loudoun County. Interestingly, it's those homes kind of in the 500 to $1 million mark, which includes a lot of townhomes on the eastern part of the county, some single family homes, you know, some of the higher end condos, but really sort of that you know, big townhome market in Loudoun County. That's where sellers are most likely to drop prices, in that 500 to $1 million mark. Sellers of higher priced homes are actually a little bit less likely to drop the price. That may be because they're setting their price expectations a little bit more reasonably from the outset, or it might reflect that buyers at the higher end have actually been a little less affected by higher mortgage rates. They tend to be more likely to be rolling equity into a new home. They might be bringing 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50% down payments to a new home purchase. And so those higher rates are not having quite as big an impact. And so maybe those sellers at the higher end are seeing a little bit more buyer interest at the price they've originally listed at. However, when they do drop prices, people in that sellers in that higher price point are dropping an average of 8%. So again, I share this information with you. If you're working with a seller who is maybe reaching for a price that might have been realistic if the market had continued to stay as frenzied as it was, you know, understanding that homes will still sell and sell relatively quickly, but setting prices appropriately is more important now than ever. In addition to, you know, resetting price expectations, frankly, there's just a lot of sellers that are staying on the sidelines. So we talk a lot about buyers pulling back in the face of economic uncertainty and higher rates. We're also seeing sellers pull back, and the number of new listings coming onto the market is lower than it was last year, but it's lower than it was in 2019. There's always a seasonal decline in the number of new listings coming onto the market. And we're seeing that for sure in our market. And we're starting at an even lower level. So this is weekly new listings data. This is for the whole Mid-Atlantic market, the whole Bright MLS footprint, which is part of our weekly stats package that comes out every Tuesday at 8 a.m. to our Bright MLS subscribers. But the red line is 2022. And so you can see the number of new listings is coming down as it typically does during the fall. If you notice in past years, aside from 2020, which was a very unusual, very strange Christmas selling season, new listings really plummet during Thanksgiving. And then, of course, during the winter holidays, you can see the number of new listings coming on the market is down. So if you're working with a buyer who might be waiting, thinking, in the next couple of months, I might see more options out there, certainly I would expect that inventory, the number of choices buyers have through the end of the year is only going to get smaller. So if a buyer's not ready to move now, they're not looking at waiting until next month. They're probably looking at waiting until the spring to see that those new listings pop back up. And even when they do, it's going to remain very, very tight. As you know, most sellers are also buyers. So potential seller is also waiting because they're looking around and seeing they have very few places to move. And at the same time, they're sitting on a sub 3% mortgage rate, perhaps, and they're seeing rates as high as 7% now. So they're saying, this home is going to work for me for now. We're seeing young adults who are having kids and who are, making their small apartment work for now because there's just, such little inventory. We're seeing sellers who might want to downsize, kind of staying put for now. So there's a lot of staying put on both the buyer and seller side. And buyers really are having to reset expectations. As I mentioned, purchasing power has been seriously eroded by rising rates. Back in September of 2021, the median sales price in Loudoun County was about $608,000. At a 3.07% average mortgage rate, that meant that the typical monthly payment was about $2,500. Look what's happened. Median sales price still up 7% year over year, estimated. This is actually October instead of September. But you can see what's happened. Even though the median price has risen by 7%, the typical monthly payment has increased, a whopping 65%. The income needed to qualify has gone up quite a bit. And so as buyers are really looking at the monthly payment, they're not looking at the price. And that's another thing that would-be sellers need to understand is that there's just less wiggle room. Buyers have less ability to pay higher prices because higher rates are upping that monthly payment. So I've mentioned mortgage rates probably 10 times already. Oops, I skipped the slide. Mentioned mortgage rates probably 10 times already. And as inflation started to rise, the Federal Reserve began to raise the federal funds rate, which is the light blue line in this chart. The goal of raising that short-term federal funds rate is to really begin to tamp down demand, right? Inflation is rising because there's too much demand in the market and not enough supply. So people wanting to buy too many things, but not having enough things to buy. So the Federal Reserve can only tackle the demand side. And so by raising short-term rates, it makes it more expensive to borrow. It makes it so that consumers want to save more instead of spend. And the goal then is to bring inflation down. But it also has the effect of raising the cost of borrowing for a home loan. So we can see that not only have our rates, now relatively high compared to where we've been the last few years, they have risen more quickly than they had since the early 1980s. So the rates aren't as high, obviously, as they were back in the early 80s, but the rate at which the pace at which they jumped up has been very, very fast. And so a buyer who was looking 6 months ago may find that they don't even qualify for a loan anymore. I expect that we're going to see some volatility in rates here over the next few months. The Federal Reserve is meeting next week, or it was meeting today, and tomorrow, November 2nd, is going to announce the rate hike. All bets are on another 3/4 of a percentage point rate hike. This has been telegraphed by the Federal Reserve. I don't expect to see a 3/4 of a percentage point increase in mortgage rates, but we could see that rate continue above 7%. The next big indicator is really going to be the data on inflation, which we will get data on inflation next week. If inflation has fallen, and it didn't last month, if it has fallen below 8%, getting down into 7%, that could be a sign that the Federal Reserve will stop moving so aggressively on rate hikes, and we could see mortgage rates, sort of stabilize. If inflation comes in high again, we should expect the Federal Reserve to double down on this rate increases, and the risks of putting us into a recession will grow as those rate hikes will come in faster, and mortgage rates could then go up to 8% and maybe above in the first quarter of 2023. So I would really watch what the Fed says tomorrow. I think they're going to say we're raising rates of 3/4 of a percentage point. And then on I think it's the 11th, watch the inflation number. Keep your fingers crossed it's below 8%. That means that what the Federal Reserve is doing is working, and we might see them backing off a little bit from future rate hikes, which could help stabilize and even potentially start to help ease on mortgage rates. Lending is becoming a lot more complicated now. So if you're working with a buyer, it's always a good idea to shop rates, but it's even more important now. There's a lot more variability in the rates the rates and terms that lenders are offering. There's also a pretty wide gap now between an adjustable rate mortgage and a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. The jumbo product is actually coming in with a lower rate than the conventional product in many cases, and that's important for buyers in Loudoun County. So I think that, again, connecting buyers with lenders you trust and lenders who can work with different situations and provide education to buyers who might not know what an ARM is or might not understand the risks associated with an adjustable rate. Knowing that those options are out there, though, I think is part of the reason why, transactions are still able to happen. I have just a couple more slides. So again, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, or we'll take questions here at the end. But, I think that we are going to see home prices fall from their peak. It has to, right? So in Loudoun County, I think the peak was this summer, and I'm going to get my numbers a little bit wrong, but I think we were probably at about 650,000 median sales price. We're going to come down from that. We're still going to be way higher than we were back in 2019. So if you're working with someone who thinks, I want to buy now and then flip in a year, I don't know who's doing that right now. That seems like a bad move. But if you're looking at someone who's going to buy now and, wants to live in their home, then, there's no indications that home values are going to come down, significantly, certainly not like they did during the Great Recession. There are some places that are at greater risk of steeper price declines. These are places where prices rose much faster than the overall region. Coastal and second home markets, you can see here, the Ocean City beaches, the Delaware coast, places where there was a big surge in second home demand during the pandemic. They're seeing inventory rise pretty quickly. We could see more inventory coming online if people look to sell their second home. If I'm hearing anecdotally that the Airbnb market is not as robust in some of these places as people had hoped. And so, there's a potential for prices to fall from their peaks, still above 2019 levels, but definitely coming down from the frenzied pace. Out in the Loudoun County market, I think also some of the markets that really boomed during the pandemic, those so-called Zoom towns, right, where people were looking to move further out, places like Rappahannock, the Shenandoah Valley, even parts of Fauquier and Warren County, where there was good internet, was a surge of buyers from Northern Virginia coming out during the pandemic, and that buyer pool has really dried up. So those markets are going to have to reset to basically to the economic conditions of the local market, to the incomes of the local market, and prices will come down a little bit faster. You can see Warren County there is highlighted in red, one of the places where prices just grew really, really quickly. Inventory is on the rise, and the household incomes are lower than the regional incomes. You can see Loudoun County and really most of the greater Washington, D.C. area is really at relatively low risk of any price declines. I do expect, though, that we're going to see prices stabilize. Looking ahead, as I mentioned, economic factors continue to shape the market. Inventory will still remain low. And even as prices come down from the peak, we'll still be 20% or more higher than where we were 3 years ago, with the greatest risk of price declines, like I said, in those second home markets and in those Zoom towns. Midterm, and we look very much at the near term, right through the end of the year, into the beginning of next year. Midterm, like 5-7 years out, really through the rest of the decade, there are a lot of very strong demographic fundamentals to suggest a very stable housing market. And it's important for us to keep that in mind, that this period of transition is happening very quickly. Things are changing very quickly. The underlying demographic fundamentals are really quite strong for a stable housing market moving forward. All of these other things we're talking about, employment, rates, inflation, consumer sentiment, builder sentiment, those are all super important for talking about, the outlook for the housing market. But strong demographics really do form the base. Demand will remain high. Millennials, as you know, are the largest demographic cohort. They're forming households, they're having children, they're getting married, and they will really drive demand for really the rest of the decade. Millennials are now between the ages of 26 and 41. The average age of a first-time buyer is 33. So you can see for the next 5 to 7 years, there will be a group of folks in that prime first-time home buying age. So this is in 2030, millennials will be 35 to 50. So just outside, they'll be in the move-up buyer. But they are still in the market. There is a lot of pent-up demand for home ownership among millennials. You can see in 2020, the homeownership rate for 25 to 34-year-olds was about 39%. If you look back to my Gen Xers, when we were 25 to 34, our homeownership rates were much higher, 45, 46%. So there's a lot of pent-up demand for homeownership. And while there are certainly challenges, higher rates, affordability, student loan debt, there is still a big pool of prospective buyers who will really be in charge of demand here in the midterm, 3, 5, 7 years out. On the supply side, while we'd all like more choices for our buyers, all signs are for supply to really stay pretty low in the midterm, not just now and into the first quarter of 2023, but really in the sort of, looking ahead throughout next year and into the following years. The primary reason is that, there's a lot of supply locked down, and baby boomers are staying in their homes longer. They're staying in those homes that, quote unquote, might be too big for them. Homes where they might want to downsize, but, they're keeping the home because adult children have moved back home, or because they like the space. They're staying in the labor market longer. They want a home office, or they frankly just, don't know where they would go if they downsized. In addition to those factors, right, the refi boom has really created this rate lock situation where more and more existing homeowners are remaining in their homes because they have locked in a mortgage rate that is below 3%, and they are not going anywhere. And so this is inventory in the DC metro area. The dark line is the actual number of active listings. The light line is the months of supply. We are still, like I said, region-wide, less than 1.5 months of supply. We might get back up to 2.5 months of supply, but it seems very unlikely that we're going to be in a typical 4 or 5 months of supply anytime soon. And so as inventory remains low, we're going to still see, pressure on prices. I mentioned the refinance activity. Over 12 million existing homeowners refinanced into a sub 3% 30-year loan. Something like 75% of homeowners now have a rate less than 4%. And folks have saved a lot on their monthly payment. And they are not going to move anywhere because of these very favorable mortgage rates that they've landed in. And at the same time, we know that older adults who own a home really want to age in place. They want to stay in their home. They're remaining in the workforce longer. They love their neighborhood. They just don't have anywhere else to go. And so for those reasons, as the baby boom population sort of ages into their 60s, 70s, it's going to take some time before we see inventory free up as, boomers head into their older years and maybe are then moving to senior housing or other living situations, or frankly, just sort of demographics are sort of moving us all through the age spectrum. So we'll be in this low inventory environment, really, I think, for the next, the rest of the decade. So that was a lot of information, I realize, and I didn't see any questions in the chat, but I'm going to make sure, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here in a moment, but I want to make sure you have my contact information. You can always reach out to me. Please do check out brightmls.com/research. We have our monthly reports, our weekly stats. We have infographics. We have blogs. We have a lot of top 10 lists. So please do check it out. If you haven't visited Bright's website in the past, if you've only gone in to use Matrix to do your listing information, please do check it out. We've got a lot of resources out there. And you can always reach out to me if you have questions or comments. On that website, you'll also find that I do a monthly webinar on housing market conditions for Bright subscribers. We do one for Baltimore, one for DC, one for Philadelphia. They're always on Thursdays. They're always at 3:15, and you can register for those online as well.